Hi everyone, we're bringing you something slightly different on the show this week. It's the first episode of a new series from The Conversation called The Making of One Nation that takes a deep dive into the Australian right-wing populist party. The series is hosted by my colleague Ashlynne McGhee in Melbourne, and you'll be able to listen to new episodes each week on the show's feed. Just search for The Making of One Nation wherever you get your podcasts and hit follow, that way you won't miss an episode. Now, over to Ashlynne.
I'm a child of the 90s and it's so tempting to start a podcast about One Nation with this.
I don't like it. No, I don't. Never did. I don't like it.
It's etched in my mind and I find it really hard to separate the real Pauline Hanson from the caricature version. But that's selling her and One Nation short. She's not a one-dimensional character, she's a political force and she's outlasted nearly everyone else in politics.
I have 2 words for you. I'm back.
That was in 2016 and I was in the press gallery in Canberra. Other than the odd story about an egregious controversy, I'd ignored her like everyone else. We thought she had no chance at the election, but how wrong we were.
Leader of the One Nation Party, Pauline Hanson, looks set to return to federal politics as a senator.
Pauline Hanson has used her first speech to the Senate to warn Australia is in danger of being swamped by Muslims.
One Nation leader Pauline Hanson has retained her seat in the Senate, being elected for a second 6-year term.
Now, a decade later, as One Nation surges in the polls, I want to go beyond the headlines, beyond the stunts, to find the real One Nation, where it's come from, how it works, and why it's becoming so popular. I'm Ashlynne McGhee, and this is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation. Episode 1, Into the Outsider. Back when I was in Canberra, I'd heard of Anna Bronowski, the documentarian with the best access to Pauline Hanson's inner circle. She made an excellent film called Please Explain and then wrote the book about it. Anna, you're now a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. Can you take me to the first time you met Pauline Hanson?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a doco maker, and one of my favourite sayings is the old adage, truth is stranger than fiction. And when I first met Pauline Hanson, truth indeed was stranger than fiction. I met her over a lunch of fish and chips in Sylvania waters. And I think it was around about 2014. And I can remember saying to her in that first meeting, look, I'm a left-wing voting progressive who was born in Japan, grew up in Asia, is totally pro-action on climate change and not necessarily someone who supports most of your policies, Pauline. But one thing I can tell you is that you have had the most interesting, controversial and influential career of any Australian independent politician. And I feel that if you were a man, this film would already have been made about you. She doesn't trust the media. She prides herself on being honest. And I think that the fact I was honest with her when I first met her was one of the reasons I ended up being able to get access.
Tell me a little bit more about how you found her as a person. You've spent a lot of time with her.
Yeah, look, I did end up spending a lot of time with Pauline. I had an intense, almost front row seat to the campaign that finally delivered her back to power after 18 years in the political wilderness. So I followed her on the hustings, and I also spent quite a lot of time at her farm just out of Brisbane. One of the things that totally surprised me about her is one of the first meals she cooked for me at her farm was Thai chicken curry. Not only that, she prides herself on finding a bargain. So when I tried to buy an organic chicken, she stopped me and said, no, get the bargain chicken. And then I said, do you want lemongrass? And she was so offended. She said, I grow my own lemongrass. And she made the most delicious Thai chicken curry with a ginger bitch, which is a cocktail that was literally designed for Hanson by her supporters back in the 90s. And it's Bundy rum and ginger ale. Anyway, I was able to get very up close and personal with Pauline and her then pilot, James Ashby, who was flying her around in a little tiny 2-engine plane with her face and Pauline's Fed Up logo emblazoned on the side all over far north Queensland. I was struck immediately by the fact that Hanson, whether you love her or hate her for what she stands for, has this X factor that most career politicians can only dream of having. She has a way of just absolutely focusing in on you and listening to you with her whole being. And she projects an air of kind of vulnerability, but also empathy. And I'm not saying this through bias. I'm saying this because the camera doesn't lie. And again and again and again, everywhere we went in far north Queensland, from country fetes to horse races to farmers markets to even White Australia rallies, it has to be said, I would see people coming up to Pauline with utter adulation.
It's about time someone else stood up and said it, but no one else has had the guts to say it. So keep work. We're really proud of what you're doing. Thanks very much.
And these were not what the mainstream media was depicting at the time as predominantly, working class, disenfranchised, regional and rural white Australians. They were a smorgasbord of Australians. They kind of gravitated to her as if she was a celebrity a lot of the time. And some got her to sign their foreheads. They had old One Nation paraphernalia. Some of them had been rusted on supporters since the 90s and were there as a pilgrimage to see her again. And as I and the camera crew were capturing these moments, I thought in the back of my mind, hang on, is the mainstream media wrong? Is it possible that Pauline actually will get back into power this time?
Let's rewind even a little bit further. So when she first burst onto the scene in the 90s, tell me a little bit about what Australia was like at the time and what Pauline Hanson was doing back then.
Yeah, so let's go back to 1996 Australia, a very, very different time to now. It's almost impossible to imagine. We were in a kind of new age, more progressive, more inclusive cultural stage of our development, where the Australian government, both sides, were actively working on increasing support for First Nation Australians, pivoting more strongly towards the fact that we were in Asia and that we should have stronger relationships with our Asian neighbours, particularly under Prime Minister Paul Keating, and in general, a kind of an open and inclusive approach to politics that is almost alien to what we're living in now. And it does sound far-fetched, but it is actually true. On top of that, there was a very strong push towards welcoming immigrants from Vietnam.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please? A piece of sea perch and 8 whiting fillets, please, Pauline.
Pauline Hanson, in this environment, was a disgruntled single mother and a small business owner working very, very hard in her fish and chip shop in Ipswich, a working-class suburb, then working-class suburb of Brisbane. And over her counter, she was hearing all sorts of grievances about how they were feeling left behind by globalisation and were watching the jobs that they had managed to enjoy, the security they'd enjoyed for generations actually, just disappearing as Australian businesses got sold off and went offshore. So she starts to talk about this and very quickly decides to run for the LNP as a candidate, and very famously made some strident and racist remarks that had the LNP sack her, dump her as a candidate, quite close to the actual 1996 federal election. Pauline Hanson, who is a very determined person, once she has a goal in her mind, was not to be stopped. And she said, well, okay, I'll run as an independent for Oxley. No one thought she had a bat's chance in hell. The mainstream media started to call her the Oxley moron. And lo and behold, come election day, Pauline Hanson is rocketed into Parliament with one of the biggest swings against the sitting Labor member ever recorded, and with huge support. And everyone was gobsmacked.
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
Fast forward a couple of months, I think it was October, and she gave the speech that for any Australian who's old enough sits in your memory.
I do not believe that the colour of one's skin determines whether you are disadvantaged.
It immediately caused shockwaves all over Australia. We weren't used to anyone saying this sort of thing in public.
Of course I will be called racist, but if I can invite who I want into my home, then I should have the right to have a say in who comes into my country.
The Parliament switchboard went into meltdown with callers ringing to respond to this speech. And what immediately galvanised the mainstream media and the two major parties into action was that a lot of the calls or responses Pauline had to her maiden speech were supportive. So that's really how Pauline Hanson went from an unknown fish and chip shop owner in Ipswich to the then most famous, most controversial independent politician Australia had ever produced.
What were those first couple of years in Parliament like for her? Because she was really ridiculed, wasn't she?
Yeah, so Hanson 1.0, let's call the first one, the Oxley moron from Ipswich, the untrained politician who had no idea really how politics worked and was genuine. Let's call her Hanson 1.0, and Hanson 2.0 is the serious, strategic, experienced, battle-hardened political operator that we see in the news today, Senator Hanson. Okay. Hanson 1.0 generated a markedly different response from the political literati, the gatekeepers, the mainstream media, and the major parties. And it was a violent and dismissive response. She was ridiculed, as you say, just very broadly.
I don't like it. No, I don't. I don't care.
She was degraded or denigrated for her fashion sense, which has always been quite loud and proud. She was disparaged for being uneducated. And, she was greeted with a level of misogyny that a lot of Australian female politicians, even today, still talk about. And I think that was a really big mistake. The more she was criticised, the more people quietly came out of the woodwork to support her.
Well, Pauline Hanson was an accident.
John Howard and the LNP and all of his apparatchiks worked very skillfully for the next 18 years to quietly repurpose Hanson's policies while distancing themselves from her vitriolic rhetoric. Even after she lost the 1998 federal election, Tony Abbott, who was then a key minister in the Howard cabinet, worked with a bunch of LNP supporters to set up a legal fund to support a case for electoral fraud that eventually saw Hanson jailed. And, if you want an example of how badly the LNP needed to get rid of her and how clearly they saw the threat she posed to the Conservative base, it's that court case and Hanson's imprisonment that proves it.
Okay, so it's August 2003. Pauline Hanson's sent to jail and she spends 11 weeks there before her conviction for electoral fraud is overturned.
Yeah.
What was that time like for her?
Look, the thing about Hanson is she's not an introverted person. She's not a retrospective person. She gets very impatient and cross quite quickly if you're just sitting her down and talking to her endlessly. So I learned very quickly that if I wanted really good responses from Hanson, like honest, emotional responses, I needed to transport her physically to the locations that had the biggest impacts on her life. I took her back to the courtroom where she was found guilty. And that was a moment that was incredibly telling because she basically cried and she took me aside and pretty much talked about how that was the absolute rock bottom moment of her life, because she had always prided herself on being honest and upstanding Australian citizen and law-abiding. And suddenly, the court had found her guilty of fraud. In those 3 months that she spent in prison, she kept diaries in this beautiful 1950s kind of copper plate handwriting. And I read them. She let me read them. They were a glimpse, I guess, of the woman behind the facade and the humiliation and the sense of despair that she had at first when she was jailed. There's a famous interview where she comes out of jail. You see the doors open and out she comes.
It's been a very daunting, distressing time. I could never explain what's done to me.
She just talks about wanting to see her family again and the simple pleasures, and she's not sure about politics for now. But, I think that there's a steeliness in her that you don't see in her earlier interviews. It gave her the kind of backbone and real politic mentality that has enabled her to survive and thrive.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed. Search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation. So, Anna, as you spend a bit more time with Pauline Hanson, you heard more about her childhood. What was it like?
Yeah, so Pauline Hanson was the youngest of 5 children and the youngest girl. And although she wouldn't say this herself, from research I've done, it seems to me that she was a little bit of a favourite of her father. And she was always a firecracker. Perhaps because she was the youngest, she had to learn to stand up for herself, otherwise she wouldn't be heard. We did a very in-depth interview over 2 days in her farmhouse. And I was trying to work out what makes Pauline Pauline. And she told me a story that I think kind of symbolises the kind of politician she's become. So when she was very young and in primary school, back then in the 50s, children used to have to drink milk. Every public primary school would line up milk bottles at recess and every child had to drink it because it was a government health initiative. Now, little Pauline didn't like the milk because her school couldn't afford refrigerators, and by the time it was served to her, it was warm. And so she started to just take the milk and then hide it under a little bench. And it got to the point where there was a whole line of mouldy milk bottles that little Hanson had stacked under the bench. And the principal summoned the entire school to a special assembly and said to them, "Which of you children has not been drinking your milk?" And there was dead silence, and at the back of the hall, little Pauline put up her hand and said, "It's me." The principal then said, "Why, Miss Hanson?" She stood up and she said, "Because I don't like it and it's not fair." I'm sharing that story because it shows the 3 features that have stayed with Hanson, the politician, that we all have to deal with every day now. 1, the politics of grievance. It's not fair. 2, the politics of the outsider who refuses to play the game, unlike professional politicians, and actually says what she's thinking. I don't like it. Politics of grievance. And 3, the politician who will stand up and say what she feels her supporters are thinking, but are too scared to say out loud, and bugger the consequences. Hanson has always prided herself on being what she calls the anti-politician, the outsider, the underdog. She was doing this way back when Trump was still doing dodgy development deals all over New York, long before he did Celebrity Apprentice, long before he decided to become a politician himself. And unlike Trump, Hanson really was an underdog. She really was a people's politician. She was working in her dad's burger shop when she was a kid. She was helping her family pay the rent. She grew up with this attitude that you pick yourself up by your bootstraps, no one owes you a living, you do it all yourself. She believed in hard work, and she did struggle, and she did work hard. Trump, on the other hand, who everyone says, is the people's politician and the outsider and represents the underdogs, as we all know, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and an inheritance from his very wealthy real estate tycoon father. So I think Australia, love her or hate her, Australia can make claim to actually producing the real people's politician in Hanson. And that brand that Hanson has, that brand has endured. And it's one of the reasons she's still around now.
Anna, what's one thing you wish we all knew about Pauline Hanson?
That she would have been a brilliant populist for the left if she'd had the right minders. She was my fair lady. She was ready to be shaped. She had an extraordinary charisma. She cared about her people. She's genuine. She's honest. And the great tragedy about Hanson 1.0 is that she attracted Svengalis and masterminds like David Oldfield, who swung her indelibly to the right. Had she had someone else in her ear, Australia might have seen a left-wing populist in the style of AOC or Bernie Sanders. She had everything in her to be a very positive force for good if she had had different minders. Now, she would hate me saying that, and I totally accept that, because now she also understands how politics works. She makes her own decisions. And she always bridled at the media saying, she's just a puppet. That's no longer true. And Hanson 2.0 is much more dangerous as a result. Not only does she understand how politics works and she makes her own decisions, she also has a far more strategic and supportive right-hand man in James Ashby, who doesn't compete with Hanson for the limelight and instead supports her in getting her message out there. And Hanson and Ashby together are one of the reasons One Nation is resurging today.
Anna, you said at the start that when you first sat down with Pauline, you said to her, at the end of this, my test is if you can still have a beer with me. So have you had a beer with her since? Do you still catch up with her?
Oh my God, that's such a great question. We had no idea when we're editing the film that she'd actually win. So when Please Explain aired on SBS, it put SBS very unusually in the top 10 because everyone wanted to know how she did it. I rang her at about 11 o'clock at night and she answered and I said, "So, Pauline, will you still have a beer with me?" And there was a very long, icy silence. And then finally, in a frosty little voice, she said, "Yes, I'll still have a beer with you, but I need to have a shower." And off she went and had a shower to kind of cleanse herself, I guess, of what she'd just watched. But I'm sure she meant it and I meant it. But after I then went away and researched Hanson further and wrote the book and really unpacked the effect of her policies, the divisive effect of her rhetoric on what has been actually a pretty successful multicultural project in Australia, I lost that affection I had as a doco maker, and I was a lot more, I suppose, intellectually critical in the book. So, yeah, I mean, I still feel affection for her, but we haven't had the beer, Ashlynne, put it that way.
Anna, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thanks, Ashlynne. It's a real pleasure to talk about this.
You can read more from Anna Bronowski at The Conversation. This is the first episode in our series of The Making of One Nation. We'll have new episodes each week. So please make sure you follow the show. And I know everyone says this, but please leave us a review. It really helps others find us. This episode was produced by Isabella Podwinski, sound designed by Michelle Macklem. Our head of editorial innovation is me, Ashlynne McGhee. Misha Ketchell is the editor of The Conversation Australia. A special thanks to our colleagues Gemma Ware, Justin Bergman and Amanda Dunn for their ideas and wisdom. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. You can sign up to our free daily newsletter by clicking the link in our show notes. You can also listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.